We can hear from Emmanuel Macron. He's with our correspondent, Stéphane Ballong.
Good morning, Mr. President. We're here at the Palais Brongniart in Paris. 40 heads of state and government. Since yesterday, a summit for climate and development at my side. This morning, Mounia Daoudi from RFI, Stéphane Ballong from France 24. Mr. President, just one more summit to save the planet.
First of all, it's not just about saving the planet, it's about reconciling the fight against poverty, fighting for biodiversity and combating global warming. So it's not just about one extra summit. It's the whole point is having leaders from all continents, because we're going through a time of a fracture, the risk of a breakup with the invasion of Ukraine, the world dividing. We cannot settle anything if the world divides. Here in Paris, the planet is here. We have the Chinese Prime Minister, the President of Brazil, President of South Africa, and many other leaders, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Europe, the United States. Secondly, this is very concrete action. 2 years ago, we launched in Paris the attribution of special drawing rights, and in particular for African countries. So we said that we need to reorient at least 100 billion euros. We're doing this now. We've pushed everybody to meet their commitments, and France is going to reallocate 40% of our special drawing rights. So several colleagues said yesterday we have reoriented the 100 billion for climate from the north to the south, and we're launching at the same time a fund for biodiversity and preserving the forest, which is intended to end up at the COP. And they're very specific things. Restructuring the debt of Zambia, which has been dragging on for years. We settled this yesterday because we have China here, and we have Senegal, which is concluding its transition agreement.
We're going to talk about Senegal. Is it also a way for you, Emmanuel Macron, to redeem yourself, as it were? You've been 6 years at Élysée. We haven't done everything fully well on that.
Well, no, I never looked at it in that way. One of the first things I did was to launch this Make Our Planet Great Again. We're consistent. We're making efforts here in France. This has been recognized because in action on climate, we haven't been condemned for climate inaction. Over 2017, 2022, we've doubled our
But we're not complying with renewable commitments.
You're quite right that we're lagging somewhat. We're going to catch up. We're going to be on the trajectory, but we are meeting our commitment to reduce emission, which is the main thing. So I'm determined to stick to this. We're going to make extra efforts through planning, but it's just that we're trying to make everything come together. France is just 1% of emissions, so we produce the aeronautical sector. We have the Le Bourget Salon, where I was at the beginning of the aeronautical sector, represents 3 to 4% of global emissions. But France produces half of the planes, so if we're able to decarbonate the sector, then we could be the champions of decarbonization of the sector, which by itself, if we remove 60%, will enable to reduce the efforts consistent with France's commitments. So this is what we've done, the One Planet Summit, One Forest Summit on climate and biodiversity issues over the past 6 years, over the past 10 years almost. France has been pulling along the rest of the planet, and we're meeting our commitments, including through financing, because we've increased our public aid to development by 50%.
Mr. President, you mentioned a divided world, the West on the one hand with its climate agenda, on the other the southern countries whose priority is to fight poverty and insecurity. Isn't that a bit of a contradiction?
This is the major risk, and therefore the first principle I set out when we opened the conference yesterday was that nobody should have to choose between poverty and biodiversity and climate. So what is wrong is when you give the impression that you're lecturing people, that you have no right to have such and such a project because it's bad for climate. So this has been the whole discussion in Africa, for example, over gas.
Well, let's take the example of Senegal. Yesterday you announced 2.5 billion support for Senegal for renewable energy. Does that mean that Senegal must stop exploiting its gas?
No. The agreement, which is the Just Energy Transition Agreement for Senegal, which is what we've done for South Africa, for Indonesia, and for several other countries, it's an agreement that seeks to enable them to have a transition which creates wealth and therefore power to produce and which reduces emissions. Senegal is committing to have 40% of renewable energy in its energy mix, but it's going to develop gas.
But this is in the form of grants, right? Isn't Senegal going into debt for that?
No, because there is a profitable business behind that. So we make concession loans over the long term. But for Senegal, we're going to enable Senegal to develop its gas projects. Why? Because gas is a transition energy, and we know that the planet will need it for the decades that lie ahead. So what we want to do is to bring the major emerging countries out of coal. This is a priority to win the climate battle, and to enable the countries to develop in the best way possible. For Senegal, this will be gas and increasing renewable energy, but 40% of renewable energy by 2030, bearing in mind that they're going to be producing gas. This is very demanding for Senegal, and that's why we've had these commitments. It will enable Senegal to develop it. We can't tell them you have gas, but you can't use it, whereas in Europe you have countries that are reopening coal mines. It doesn't make sense. Now, nobody can succeed unless we win this joint battle on poverty, climate. I think you cannot choose. The countries of the Global South are reserves, biodiversity reserves, and also the lungs of the planet, and in particular for our forests, and therefore the major forest fund is a key component.
Mr. President, we were talking about debt a moment ago, precisely on debt. For years and years now, we've been talking about debt relief, restructuring. For years, nothing has really changed. Shouldn't we simply just cancel that debt?
Well, there are things that are changing. There are changes. We did this for Chad, and we're concluding on Zambia.
Took 3 years.
France is playing a key role, and we need to have sustainable financing models. If you cancel the debt, that means nobody will lend in future. If you tell the lenders, well, we're cancelling all the debt. Since these are models that are not self-financing, well, good luck if you want to find people to lend money. Now, what is unbearable, is not admissible, is that there are economies today which are biodiversity reserves, which are absolutely key for the planet, which have the demographics, the youth of mankind, which are not being financed properly, and which I'm just trying to give you a structured answer to this. What we need to do is to restructure the debt. The major problem of the past 15 years is that when you restructure the debt, we, the European countries, North America, the G7 countries, the very same countries from whom you were cancelling the debt, we're going to go to China. And that's what happened basically everywhere, so on the continent. So what did we do on the French initiative under a G20 chaired by Italy? We said to the Chinese, look, you have to join us for the global framework. We applied the global framework to Chad and now for Zambia, because nobody, even when we push for this and we say we're going to reschedule the debt, give up the amounts that are owed to us. So what do you how can you say to people, we're going to give up on our debt?
The debt contracted from China.
So everybody's made an effort.
Is that a problem, the debt from China? Is it a trap for developing countries?
If it gets beyond a certain threshold, yes. So we need to have a common framework, which is the OECD framework, which defines what is sustainable debt. It's like you. It's the same thing as over-indebtedness for a household. Debt is not a bad thing when it enables you to get going. But we've financed in Europe models for development after the Second World War. Now you have to, this is what we're doing for Zambia. We're rescheduling their debt. So all the wealthiest country, including China, have to sit around the table. And this is what we're doing. It's innovative, and that's how we will get out of the debt trap.
Have you discussed it with the Chinese Prime Minister yesterday?
When I went to China, I had that discussion with the Chinese Prime Minister. That's why he's here. And as you have said, for Zambia, we've been waiting for 3 years, and they're here. And we're going to have to continue on countries like Ghana and others, which are in great difficulty. We have to restructure the debt. Now, our approach to financing the African economies is no longer the right approach. So, yes, we have to reschedule debt much more vigorously. Secondly, we have to better remunerate the biodiversity reserves in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, the tropical forest. This is what we're, the rainforest. This is what we're doing with the fund for the funds for nature, and we're going to sign contracts country by country. And we have to say we have to agree that we should spend more. We have to better mobilize. And this is one of the very practical conclusions. The IMF and the World Bank are completely changing their approach. So they're going to be financing much more. And let's not forget that we have to mobilize much more private sector financing.
I was going to come to that. We're installed this morning on the trading floor, the former headquarters of the stock market. Without the money of billionaires, of large companies, they won't be able to make it, right?
Exactly. So there are two things that have to be done. Number one, every time we put €1 of public financing, when we have €1 of private sector, for the emerging countries, it's possible. What are we lacking? First of all, each time we have a program, we have to be sure that private sector financing couldn't do the job better. And this is how we have the World Bank and the IMF. And secondly, we have to have a different method with leverage. And this is the commitment we made yesterday. So in other words, when we put €1 of World Bank financing, we have at least €1 from the private sector. This is absolutely fundamental. And that's why what we have to do is to reduce the risk. There's a lot of private sector money, and this is why France is mobilized very actively, because we mobilize all the sovereign funds, all the major investment managers, all the private sector funds. And what are they saying? They're saying we don't go into such and such a country because there's a foreign exchange risk, or we don't go to another country because there's a political risk, or another country, if there are too many losses for our shareholders, they won't follow us. So the private sector has to make a profit. So what should we do if we want to have leverage on the public sector financing? We need to innovate in order to have mechanisms that are there as a backup, as a guarantee to absorb an initial loss in order to trigger the private sector investments.
In a few months' time, Mr. President, there'll be a global minimum tax rate on large companies at the risk of upsetting. We should have a climate wealth tax globally in France.
Now, you'll never get me reacting with shock. No, we need an international reaction. Why did I cancel part of the wealth tax in France? Because we were the only ones to have this.
Global climate wealth tax?
Now, as I was saying yesterday, I was jokingly to some of our friends, we're at the frontier of tax creation in France. We have a tax on finance transactions. Who else has done this around us? Almost nobody. So it doesn't work when you do it by yourself, because you're punished for this, you're penalized, and the funds go elsewhere. So to finance climate change or poverty, yes, now we're being told that we should have a tax on air tickets. We're doing this in France. Who else is doing it? Nobody. It doesn't work when we do it by ourselves. So I mean, okay, so let's penalize our air companies and they'll all go to the Gulf states to make money. It doesn't work. Third proposal, and I commend the mobilization of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. The maritime sector is not taxed. It's one of the only ones. So it has to be taxed, but not just the French players you have to tax. The French, North Europeans, the Chinese. It works when you have international mobilization.
So France won't set the example on the wealth tax.
France is one of the France that has the heaviest taxation. We're going to set an example by having, for example, the minimum tax. So I call on for mobilization. Help us go to the countries that don't have any tax, for example, on air tickets. Help us mobilize with the International Maritime Maritime Organization so that we have a tax with China on maritime transport. And a year ago, the slogan was socialism in one country. That doesn't work. And taxation in one country doesn't work either. It's not international taxation in it. So, just to mobilize the private sector, the other point is, yes, creating an international tax for Africa. That's what we need.
Mr. President, there's a big absentee at the Paris summit, Russia. Can you move forward on your agenda without one of the key players, one of the major producers of energy in the world?
Well, yes, here we have an agenda which seeks to say that, which tells us that we mustn't choose between climate and fighting global poverty and biodiversity. Each country has to be respected in its path. We need more public finance and we need more private sector funders. These are the main conclusions of the summit with very, very specific measures to back it up. So who do we need for that? We need the United States, China, the G20, the major emerging countries, and the poorest countries.
Russia?
So the G77, which represents those countries, Russia is part of the G77, and in several respects, China is one of its prominent members. And then the Cuban president spoke yesterday. He's chairing the G77. What does this summit tell us? It tells us about the isolation of Russia.
Should we resume dialogue with Russia?
I think Russia has to stop the war. It has to respect international law.
Mr. President, if Putin calls you tomorrow morning, do you pick up the phone or not?
Well, of course I'll take his call. I have no reason to call him at present. There's a Ukrainian counteroffensive. The time will come, I hope, when there will be negotiations on Ukrainian terms. But if he calls to propose something, then I'll take the call, of course, because France has always sought to facilitate, to mediate. But let's be clear, at present, resumption of a dialogue is only possible if there's respect for international law, which is the only way we can live in peace. Russia, you're quite right, like other major countries which are here, Nigeria is a major oil producer. It's 250 million inhabitants on the planet. India refines oil, all these countries have to be accompanied in the transition, and Russia has to be one of those countries. So the foundation for this, the countries that we need in order to make these changes, are all here.
For you, Mr. President, Russia today, is it an enemy, notably in Africa?
I don't like these terms. That's not what diplomacy is about. At present, Russia, of its own will, has put himself in a situation where it no longer respects international law, where basically it's become one of the only colonial powers of the 21st century, waging a colonial war against its neighbor Ukraine, and it's destabilizing influence in Africa through private militia, which are predators, which wage atrocities against the civilian population, as we've seen through Wagner in the Central African Republic. So Russia's choices today mean that it's not playing a beneficial role for the international community.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this interview.
Thank you very much. I always show charts. You can show this to your viewers, but when you talk about climate and development, this is done by the French Development Agency, the AFD. We'll let you keep it, but it shows where the challenges are. That you see, here we're in this category. We're among the wealthiest countries, and we're among those that pollute the most. And the idea is to ensure that there is an agreement between emerging countries and the wealthy. If we have an agreement whereby India, China, Nigeria can develop without polluting, that means we'll win the climate battle at global level. So the poorest countries, the developing countries, have to be helped on fighting against poverty, but they're far from being the biggest polluters. The key is that we reduce our emissions and that we enable the major emerging powers to have their own development without increasing their
For that
emissions.
reason that you wanted to take part in the BRICS summit,
Yes, it's a key point, exactly. That's why we have these jet Ps with South Africa, with Senegal, and tomorrow with Nigeria, and I propose this with Brazil. That's the key for the planet. We have to focus on the essential points. The essential point is an agreement between the emerging countries and the wealthy countries, and to get out of coal.
Thanks for watching us. France Info, RFI, and France 24.